Welcome once again to the Emotionally Wealthy Podcast. And while I hope that you are enjoying your summer, I also am taking breathing room this summer and will continue to share some conversations from podcasts where I have been a guest. And for today's episode, which originally aired in April of 2026, I was a guest on the Medlife Support Podcast hosted by Dr. Lisa Muehlenbein. Lisa and I had a wonderful conversation where we talked about the emotional layers of what it's like to have the role of a medical spouse and experience the unexpected emotional realities that so many partners of the medical profession face every day and quietly navigate on a day-to-day basis. I think you're going to find a lot of connections to the conversations that we have here on the Emotionally Wealthy Podcast. And so here you go. I invite you to enjoy.
Welcome back to the show. Today's conversation is one I've been looking forward to because it speaks directly to the emotional undercurrent that so many partners in medical families quietly carry. My guest today is Karen Conlon, licensed clinical social worker, therapist, and the host of the Emotionally Wealthy podcast. Karen's work centers on emotional awareness, identity, and the internal experiences we are often taught to minimize, especially in high-pressure relationships and family systems, just like in medicine. In our conversation today, we explore the emotional reality many partners of medical professionals live with. Loneliness that's hard to name, sacrifice that slowly becomes invisible, and complex emotions like guilt, shame, jealousy, and resentment that are rarely acknowledged yet deeply human. What I greatly appreciate about Karen's lens is that it doesn't pathologize these experiences. Instead, it helps us understand them as natural responses to long-term imbalances and reminds us that multiple emotions can exist at the same time without canceling each other out. This is a conversation about naming what's real, releasing self-blame, and creating space for emotional honesty in lives shaped by medicine. Karen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm super excited to be here. The medical profession is a profession that's very near and dear to me. And so I am so happy to be here to support physicians and their spouses and their families overall. So thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's my pleasure. And I'm excited for the listeners to learn more about you and to learn more about themselves, really. So for those listeners who may be meeting you for the first time, please share a little bit with us about your work and what drew you to focus so deeply on emotional awareness in relationships and family systems.
Sure. So I actually became a psychotherapist in my early 40s. Actually, I had a different career and a different life in corporate sales before that. And then I decided that I wanted to do this type of work. And so I specialize in trauma and adult attachment and anxiety disorders. And then more recently, I actually moved over to coaching. And with the coaching work, I help people with mindset change through a combination of self-awareness and practical skills. So that's been interesting being a career changer in early 40s, but I'm so glad I did it. And there were a few milestones that made me go into reflection mode, honestly, that got me to this place of thinking more about emotional awareness and relationships. I had my daughter at age 37, and I wanted to give her quality time that I wasn't able to have with my own mom just due to sheer need and circumstances. And then when I did that, I was able to do that for a couple of years. I realized that I started to struggle with my own identity because I wasn't bringing home the bacon. I wasn't bringing home money into the relationship. And for so long, that is where my identity lived. And so after my daughter was born, I also started to become more aware of the messages that I was getting, both, externally and internally. So internally, I was giving myself these messages about not resting and like, oh, I should be doing something when she's sleeping. And, you and I and anyone who's had a child knows that if you have a few minutes to rest, especially when they're newborns or little ones, take it. But that's not really the message that I was getting. As a matter of fact, my mom, I remember her mentioning I was like 1 month into my daughter being born. And she mentioned to me, oh, now you have downtime. This would be a great time to start an internet business. And I was like, no, what? So no, I need to sleep. I need to have bottles to wash. Anyway, so that started that journey into awareness. I started to notice the cracks in my own family of origin system. And then I also started to notice patterns in my husband's family systems. It really brought my feelings into consciousness. And I really started to feel those feelings and think about the whys. And so I think the big difference from the before and the after is that in the past, I would have felt upset, angry, disappointed. I thought that I knew why, but I really didn't go deeper than that. And when the reflection piece came in, to be specific, that's what really made the difference. And then, of course, I added therapy to the mix,
Uh-huh.
and that really helped me to go deeper and understand the root of so many things, the dynamics that I was starting to notice, and the behaviors that I was seeing around me, and including my own.
Uh-huh.
And to be honest with you, Lisa, the self-awareness piece was initially very hard because I often felt very alone, very unseen, even though I was surrounded by family, especially with a new baby. They wanted to be
Right.
around the new baby all the time. But I felt very, very alone because I felt like I was the only one that was taking notice.
Mhm.
And so
Wow.
that started my journey into this.
Well, you just hit on so many um, pain points, I think, for many of us. I was listening to you and I can totally relate to the changing careers,
Yeah.
changing directions. I
Yeah.
feel like after being in yoga for, 20 plus years, now moving into, serving physician families, even though I've been a part of that for so long, this is like my second chapter and my opportunity to give back and help those people who I know what they're going through because I've been there.
Yeah.
And, you're talking about the baby and how everyone thinks like, oh, you're going to have this downtime. It's going to be great. But nobody really takes advantage of that time to go, nope, I just need to rest. We do think about, oh, well, I'm here, so I need to do the laundry. And oh, there's all these other home
Yeah.
projects that maybe I've been wanting to do, but I haven't done. So now that I'm here, I should be doing it when,
Yes.
we're not practicing that self care. And when you also described feeling alone, but there being people around because you had a new baby, that feeling of loneliness is very common in the medical community. And partners of physicians often describe feeling a very specific kind of loneliness where they are surrounded by people, but yet
Hmm.
they are emotionally unseen.
Yeah.
So, from your clinical perspective, what distinguishes this type of loneliness from other forms of relational loneliness?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Just actually to give you context, I worked at a hospital setting
Hmm.
previously, and we were a social bunch. So there were a lot of opportunities where I had physicians, coming up to me just for like casual chats or encounters, and so I got to very organically learn about their lives in little bits and pieces, right? About their internal lives, their external lives. And then, like I said before, we were a social bunch. So we would have social gatherings and dinners and things like that. And I would get to meet the partners and spouses. And it was really interesting because once you got a little bit more beyond the surface, you did start to hear things, the vulnerabilities, the things that are so often masked by jokes or stoicism, especially around the theme of loneliness.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you think about there's different types of loneliness, obviously, but if you think about like these specific types of loneliness, sometimes there's loneliness that comes from a lack of intimacy, right? And that can look like a couple or a family that does a lot together, but there's this vacuum, right? Like a lacking of an emotional connection or attunement in the relationship. And then other times, there's another type of loneliness, like a communal, collective loneliness, where maybe you live in a community or you've moved to a community because of the work situation, maybe, or maybe your finances change and you can, maybe move to a different place or a better situation.
Mm-hmm.
But then you find yourself living in a community where maybe there are people or the community values are different than yours. And I think this is something, for example, that you see a lot now with the political climate where there's so much division, diversity amongst neighbors, right? And so you can feel isolated, for example, in that way too.
Mhm.
even when you're surrounded by a lot of people. So this is like more of a collective type of loneliness.
Mhm.
And then there is the loneliness that arises from not having depth in your
Mm.
relationships, like just having like that surface level
Mhm.
chat, not much depth. And I think that for physician spouses and, within the realm of this relationship, that type of loneliness that you're describing, in my view, is unique because it has a little bit of each of these
Mhm.
components.
Yeah.
So, like busy, different schedules, unpredictable schedules, those things can create a vacuum in the intimacy area because both partners may be overextended, right? Each of the roles that they play. And then that in turn makes interactions oftentimes then become very focused on practicalities. When you are interacting, you're talking about, oh, what time are you getting home? Oh, can you make the parent teacher conference? What
Mhm.
days, are practice? Who can do what, when, and where? So here's where you see the loneliness that comes from that lacking of depth, right? Where
Mhm.
where if you have that depth, those are the conversations that you have where it's not just about practicality and schedule planning. So of course, we've got these types of loneliness where you can be, and I'm thinking now about the collective, the community. This one is particularly hard because that is not limited to community or neighborhood. That can also be surrounded, yeah, by family and friends, right? Who are either telling you or making you feel like you have a great life because you're married or partnered with a doctor or you're a stay-at-home mom or a stay-at-home partner. And we all know that the work at home is sometimes a lot harder than going into an office. And so there's almost this feeling of like, I can't complain because the feeling around me is that I should be happy with this privileged life, right? And so
Right.
I find that there's not a lot of people in your sphere who see the sacrifices as significant because those sacrifices are often internal and emotional and psychological, if that makes sense.
Right. Right. Absolutely. And when I'm hearing you describe, the different types of loneliness, that's really helpful and eye-opening because I don't think
Mm.
we often think about different types of loneliness that we might be experiencing. We just know that we're feeling lonely. And everybody is contributing in their way to this partnership. And unfortunately, sometimes we feel like it's hard, but we're not allowed to complain about it. But yet at the same time, when it's meaningful, it doesn't mean that it's can't also be hard and that there can be two truths at
Yes.
the same time where we can be grateful for this life, but we can also be feeling lonely and we can be feeling like we've sacrificed a lot. You talked about moving to different locations, and that is so common in medical families. We've moved to 4 different states. And then within the state, as our life has changed, we've moved a total of 11 times in our
Wow.
time together. And that was really to follow his career. And
Yeah.
many spouses, including myself, have felt like we've sacrificed for their career
Yeah.
because we love them and we want to support them and we want the best for them. But at the same time, it comes as a sacrifice or a feeling of loss that we oftentimes frame as just part of the deal for medical families. Talk to us about at what point does sacrifice quietly shift into self erasure, and how can partners begin to recognize that transition? Because many partners feel pressure to stay strong because the physician's work is so demanding. And
Yeah.
yeah, talk to us
Yeah.
about that.
I mean, it is subtle for sure. And it's a very personal experience. So different for everyone. But regardless of how it shows up for different people, I would say that when you start telling yourself the narrative that I shouldn't be sad, I shouldn't be mad, I shouldn't be angry, et cetera, right? Fill in the blanks.
Hmm.
Because look at how much they work or sacrifice or whatever. Well, you're also on some level telling yourself that you should feel bad,
Hmm.
or guilty or ashamed of yourself for wanting more.
Hmm.
Or also when you stop doing things for yourself because the schedule keeps changing and your time is only as valuable as your physician partner's schedule allows it to be.
Mm,
That's another place where I think this very quietly starts to happen, right? These shifts start to happen because these are
right.
gradual, right? You're kind of adapting. It's not like one big change. You're just kind of slowly adapting to this week and that week and then next week. But I think the worst one is when spouses or partners say to themselves, "Well, I chose this life and I knew what I was getting into." And I say that because yeah, sure, maybe to some extent you have an idea, right? Because maybe you dated this person for a long time or maybe you grew up in a household where you had a parent who was a physician. So you think that you have an idea of what you're getting into. But first of all, choosing this life does not mean that you stop choosing yourself. And I think that that
Mm,
is a very important distinction because I think there's this very natural sort of feeling that choosing this life means you stop choosing yourself because then that would be selfish on some level.
right, right,
And also the other part of that sentence, which is I knew what I was getting into. I mean, it's not really true because unless you had a crystal ball and you can sort of time travel yourself into your future body, there's just no way that you're going to know what you're getting into emotionally, right? Like what the
right,
psychological, emotional demands are going to be. The physical demands, if you have children, right, that need to be taken here or there. And certainly you're not going to know what you would feel like emotionally. It's not the same thing witnessing it versus having the lived experience. So
right.
you can say, for example, I remember how sad, and I know how sad mom was because dad missed so many holidays or milestones, right? And the reality is that you can't really know because you weren't in her body, right? It wasn't your experience. You can absolutely empathize and you can imagine, but that feeling was not your own. On the other end of the spectrum, you can also have this visual of, and I'm using mom here, just kind of thinking of it, in the most traditional
Sure.
sense of the word, right? So you can also say on the other side of that spectrum, well, mom was a trooper. Man, I mean, she really held it together. She kept us busy. We always had something to do. And, perhaps not considering that that may have been something that she was doing out of necessity, right? And as a way of needing to cope or even for emotional survival. And so
Right.
I think what you call self erasure, I call self abandonment, but they both
Mhm,
lead,
mhm.
down the same path.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I think back, when we talk about how we can tend to think, oh, I knew what I was getting into.
Mhm.
But being in this life as long as I have been, my husband and I've been together almost 30 years. When he was in residency is when we started dating. And yes, when we started dating, I knew what that life was like because I was actually working at the hospital in his department, and that's how we met. I knew probably more than what a lot of people do going into it because I saw him every day at
Right.
home and at work. But I was just telling someone this recently. I was talking about how things have changed in the last 30 years in medicine. And we have, like I said earlier, we've lived in multiple states. We've had multiple types of jobs where, he's in radiology, but he was in solo practice in a small rural hospital
Mhm.
for one of his jobs. And he worked 7 days a week for the first 6 years that we lived there.
Wow.
And that was, yeah, that was not great. I'm just going to say it was not
Yeah.
great, but we've also been part of groups. He's worked teleradiology. We've been part of physician owned groups and hospital owned groups. And now we're going through a transition where we were part of a private equity and now we're being sold to a private company. There's been so many
So many.
changes. And, when he was in residency, private equity didn't even exist.
Yeah.
And so it was very different. And I can honestly say, even though I feel like I had an idea, the idea that I had does not match the reality of what is 30 years later. And so where we're at right now, and for people coming out of residency right now, it's going to be very different 30 years from now for
Yeah.
them. Truly, even if you think you've had the best understanding of what it's like to be in this type of relationship, maybe your parents were physicians, you don't. You have an
Right.
idea, but a lot of times that idea does not match the reality because life changes in medicine and it changes fast. And, when we have this idea of what it's going to be, and then it doesn't turn out that way, we end up saying, "Oh, I didn't think it would be like this. I thought it would be different." And many of the spouses that I interviewed in my work, that is what I heard a lot was,
Yeah.
"Didn't think it would be like this. I thought it would be different. I didn't think it would be this hard." And that really takes an emotional toll on the spouses because that feeling of guilt and shame comes up again and again. The guilt for wanting more, so more time with your partner, more quality experiences, more just life together, more hoping that life would be the way you thought it would be, and shame for feeling unhappy when it looks different than what you thought. And maybe it looks, successful on the outside, but you're feeling a little lost or empty or lonely on the inside. So, why do you think these emotions seem so pervasive in medical families?
Well, I mean, first of all, I just want to first, honor what you said about your own experience. And, you are a perfect example of, what we were just talking about. You were there, you were witnessing, you were in it with him, you were on the floor. And so you were probably 95% better equipped to have an idea of what to expect
Hmm.
than
Yeah.
most, right? Or than someone who's not there. And
Hmm.
so you probably already went into the relationship with a bigger tolerance level, bigger understanding, a bigger understanding of what might the expectations be for him and for you. And so I think that the fact that you are able to also now, almost 30 years later, say, but we also didn't account for
Right.
change number one, change number two, change number three, and none of these things are things that you plan for. That's the thing, because you can plan all you want, but life happens.
Yep. Yep.
And so these are the things that we don't account for, right? And so this is you talking from a perspective of someone who has pretty well equipped herself before and during, and still you've found yourself feeling these things, right? And so in terms of like the tolls, I mean, I think that just like with anything, right? There can be highs and lows. And when the highs are high, the lows the lows feel like they can be more tolerable. You know what I mean? When you're
Right.
up in that high,
Yep.
but the thing is that when you're constantly or consistently minimizing your own needs,
Hmm.
it's like a bad habit that becomes harder and harder to break the more you do it, right?
Mm. Yeah.
And even acknowledging that there's a problem in the first place, it becomes a problem in and of itself. Feelings come into play like anxiety and depression. And I think in my experience that physician spouses particularly fall into the category, and I'm generalizing here, right? But they typically fall more into the category of high functioning anxiety and
Hmm.
depression. So
Hmm.
it's harder to pinpoint because
Right.
they're kind of going, 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 right? And depression doesn't always look like what we envision depression to be like, oh, I can't get out of bed. That is absolutely not. You are probably interacting every day with someone who is a high functioning anxiety and depression situation. And,
Hmm.
they're socializing and they're talking to you, but you don't know what's going on in their inner world, right? And
Right.
maybe being at work is the temporary thing that gets them out of that funk,
Hmm.
But I think that when you're in a marriage where there are children specifically, that factor tends to make that minimization of your own needs grow exponentially
Right.
because you tell yourself that it's selfish to take that hour and a half to do the yoga class or to get a manicure because you should be attending every single one of your kids' games, right?
Right.
Or that your partner maybe shouldn't have to take care of the kids so that you can go have dinner with your friends because they've worked so long, and there's you're in that self-sacrificing role that you take on, and you do it long enough, it can absolutely become a part of your identity.
Right, right. And then there's an emotional weight that comes from carrying all these different feelings, and it can, kind of be self-inflicted. That emotional weight can come from within. And how much do you think is driven by broader social narratives around medicine, success and gratitude, and holding it together?
Oh my gosh. So much of it, I think, but it also depends, right? It depends on your social norms, it depends on your culture, it depends on the values that you learned at home, both covertly and overtly. But oftentimes there's an image, right, that needs to be held up. And if you think about it, physician's spouse. is often expected to be the backbone of the
Mhm.
family to a certain degree. So if you break down or fail in some way, it's kind of perceived as, whatever bad thing happens is your fault because
Right.
your spouse is at work and doing what they're supposed to be doing, but you somehow failed. And
Mhm.
it's as if you're not holding up your end of the bargain. But I think that the profession itself also holds or maybe expects physicians and their spouses to function at a higher level.
Mhm.
So the system itself is also contributing to the
Yes.
idea, that everyone who is a part of this world needs to hold it together better than others outside of that profession.
Mhm.
So the emotional weight or pressure to function biologically, psychologically, emotionally, and socially at a higher level is actually reinforced by the way that the medical systems are set up. So whether it is because of the, long shifts that, they're expected to work or because of the sheer number of patients that they need to
Mhm.
see, right? The expectations. We know that there's a quota always, right? The spouse does not get to escape from the pressure and the stress that comes with that. There is a
Right.
very real ripple effect that comes with that.
Yes, I'm nodding my head yes in agreement. And you were talking about how when something goes wrong, we can see it almost as a personal failure. And what happens psychologically when partners interpret that distress that they're feeling as a personal flaw rather than a predictable response to a chronic imbalance? Because truly, the system is not supporting physician families. So I would love to hear your take on that.
Well, I think that it's very hard when you're in it to have a bird's eye perspective or look at things from a bird's eye view. And I think that when you are in a space where you feel the pressure of having to always be responsible for
Mhm.
this or for that, you see yourself sometimes in a silo versus being in a partnership.
Mm,
And so it's very easy to self blame versus looking at things as like there's an imbalance here, right? And I think that in and of itself becomes its own form of distress.
right.
And that can lead to a lack of self confidence or of the internal narrative of like, what's wrong with me? I should be happy or feel fine. And so a lot of self blame also, I think, when things don't work out the way that they're supposed to, like if you're supposed to figure something out, right? Well, it's like, well, you have the time to figure it out. And all of a sudden there's a self blame of like, oh well, I should have known or I should have known better, or I should have had the time or made the time. And so I think that the most difficult part, however, of the self-blame piece in this scenario is that when there are cracks in the relationships or dissatisfaction, I find that there are spouses out there who blame themselves for not keeping the spark up or
Mhm.
not being understanding enough, almost as if you're supposed to be the creative one, the one that's always supposed to create the intimacy, create the scenario. And so, like I said before, when you're in that mindset, it's really hard
Mhm.
to look at things from a higher level. Because if you are, then maybe you're able to say, hey, maybe we need to hit the reset button here in some areas, not in our whole life, but
Right.
maybe in some places where we should be paying more attention and maybe admit that the way we were doing things is no longer working and that maybe we need to look at making some changes.
Mhm.
And so I think those are some of the things that happen when, you take these distresses as a personal flaw versus this is an imbalance and it's chronic and it's long term and we really need to look at, very specifically what we need to address.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, we talked earlier about some of those feelings that can come up, like
Yeah.
jealousy, resentment. And we talked about how some of these feelings can coexist. And I think a lot of not just medical families, not just medical marriages and relationships, but partners in general, they're
Yeah.
afraid to admit when they're feeling this kind of way. And when we're talking about physician families and marriages, I think
Yeah.
that jealousy can come up when you're looking at the hospital or, the organization, medicine is taking their spouse away from them and they're feeling resentment. And I often refer to medicine as the medical mistress.
Yeah.
And, for some, there's a double entendre there in some
Yeah.
relationships, but truly it is a third wheel in your marriage and can cause so many different emotions to come up that people just don't really want to talk about. And why do you think these emotions are so stigmatized in medical marriages or in marriage in general?
Well, I mean, I think there's a combination of things. I think that if you think about jealousy and envy, if you look at the most basic meaning, right? With jealousy, it's I'm afraid of losing that
Hmm.
or losing something. And with envy is I want something that they have.
Right.
Right? So if you look at it from that very basic concept for those two terms, well, jealousy can come in the form of jealousy of patients and colleagues, right? Because
Hmm.
what are you afraid of losing? You're losing their time, their attention to them, right?
Hmm.
But same with envy because you want more of that time, more of their attention and whatever else might be happening in your particular relationship. But it's stigmatized because again, there's this feeling of privilege somehow, and maybe with even a perception that you have this great life and that your spouse is the one with all of the pressure. And then you get to do the other stuff.
And so when we're experiencing these different emotions, the highs, the lows, everything that comes with being involved in a medical marriage,
Yeah.
that gives us some valuable information if we're willing to receive it. Tell me how we can use that information rather than suppress it or judge those feelings. What can we do to use that information when it comes up?
I'm so glad that you asked this question because there are so many opportunities for reframing. And I agree with you that these feelings are not just feelings, emotions. Feelings are signals,
Hmm.
right? That our bodies and minds are giving us about a situation, about a person, about, an environment. And
Hmm.
so if you're willing to look at it further and dig a little deeper and just say, wait, okay, this is what I'm feeling. And then say, what might this be telling me? And then kind of doing the opposite or trying to think about the opposite. If I wasn't feeling this, what's on the other side of that? What would be on the other side of that coin? So, for
Hmm.
example, if you can reframe these feelings, such as jealousy or envy, as I miss you or
Mm.
I miss myself, I'm lacking in meaning or purpose in my life.
Mhm.
I love being a mother or father or spouse, but it's not enough.
Mhm.
I'm growing, but that doesn't mean that we have to grow apart.
Yes.
So I think that these are really good opportunities to reframe, revisit, and maybe even redefine what it is that these emotions are trying to tell us.
Mhm. And I think that can be unsettling for people sometimes. And that's where I see a lot of couples and partners get stuck. And not because they're doing anything wrong, but because they've never been given permission or told that it's acceptable to hold competing emotions at the same time, that these two things can coexist. And I think if we've done anything today in this conversation, we've definitely given permission for people to feel or have two emotions at the same time.
Yeah.
And when we can identify what we're feeling and we can put a name to it, that creates some self awareness,
Yeah.
which can often be understood as, we need to fix ourselves. I'm self aware. So that means there's something wrong with me that I have to fix. So, how do you help partners build awareness without turning it into self criticism or self blame?
Yeah. And before I answer that, I want to say something about these emotions that
Hmm.
don't seem like they should be together, but they are.
Hmm.
I think it's really important to normalize for people and remind people that very often and more often than not, seemingly opposing feelings do coexist. And if we can name them, I think
Hmm.
that's the relief, right? The unsettling part of it is living with the fact that we're feeling this and that.
Hmm.
The relief part of it is naming them
Hmm.
and being able to accept that this is an and situation, not an or, right? So, for example,
Right.
you can love someone and not like them all the times. I mean, your kids
My
included.
gosh.
You can love your kids and not always like them, right? So there's that. You can have gratitude for the life that you've created, and also at the same time grieve the one where there was a lot less to do and you had more time. You have pride or be proud of your physician spouse, and also resentment for the time that they are away for so long.
Yeah.
I think that when you're allowed to feel those feelings and express them in an emotionally safe space, it can bring relief. And by the way, I think it can open up your creativity about what else you might want to try out. So I
Mhm.
wanted to kind of mention that because I think that's actually a really big thing that goes beyond physicians spouses. I think this is, it's really a common thing that people struggle with.
Mhm.
And in terms of self-awareness and the whole fixing yourself, once you're self-aware, you're fixing yourself. No, self-awareness is a tool, just like
Mhm.
any tool, right? Becoming self-aware doesn't mean that you're going to do something about it or that you fix it. It just means that now you have some information that you can decide to either do something about or not. Becoming self-aware opens up the opportunity to make choices, to do
Mhm.
something, to address something, to accept yourself and to accept things as they are rather than how you'd like them to be. And
Mhm.
that in and of itself is a starting point. So self-awareness is just that. It's a tool. It's not an action. It's a
Right.
it's a thing that you hold that gives you information for you to decide what you want to do with it. Right? You can also avoid it. You can say, "Okay, I know that and I'm just going to keep going the way I'm going."
Right.
Okay, so that's the thing. And also, when I've worked with couples in the past, so I've started from a place of personal accountability. And,
Mhm.
that's very different than self-criticism and self-blame, because accountability, in my view, is very empowering.
Mhm.
And when you can say, I own this, it takes away other people's power to hold it over you.
Right.
Self criticism and self blame, on the other hand, can feel shameful and stuck and helpless. And so, starting from a place of personal accountability when you're working with couples is not an easy place to start with, because couples come into counseling a lot of times like with the expectation that they're going to be able to talk about the dissatisfaction that they have with the relationship, with the partner. And I think that's something that's really important for people to understand in general, is that pointing fingers has not worked until now. Just because you're changing the space where you're doing it in does not mean that that's going to change. Yeah, you
Yeah.
might have someone mitigating or keeping the temperature down, but it's not going to work, because the biggest struggle that people have in understanding and accepting is that you cannot change the other person.
Mhm.
This is by far the 100% hardest point to get across. And and it's also the single most underlying issue that I've seen. There's this constant attempt to get the other person to see it from your perspective, or like see it from your point of view. And you really can't force that on somebody. You can't make that happen,
Mhm.
right? There needs to be a certain level of acceptance around this. And while it is admittedly incredibly hard to do, because this is an emotional issue, and what I'm talking about is a very practical stance, right? Taking
Mhm.
accountability of the self. I do feel that it's the way to go. I have been through it. I have done it myself. I have been in that place with my spouse in couples therapy and being like, but you're not hearing me. You're not listening. And after a while, it's like, wait a minute. I've been doing this for how long now? And he's not getting it.
Mhm.
Okay, maybe I've got to just sit back and assess for a moment and let him be who he is and do what he needs to do, so that I can assess if this is a relationship that I can be in.
Right.
But that's scary as hell, right? Because now you're looking at things like, okay, what if I can't change this person?
Mhm.
Which is a reality. The thing is, you're coming in with your own stuff unprocessed a lot of times. Your partner, by the way, is also dealing with their own stuff a lot of times unprocessed as well. And a lot of times what we're bringing into our relationships are these problems, right? These subconscious patterns, these values, these mindsets that are that drive our psychological bus, if that makes
Mhm.
sense, and cause us sometimes to like respond and react in a way that leaves us feeling like, why did I react that way? Why am I behaving this way? This happens in our parenting as well. It happens in our other relationships also, apart from our spouses.
Yeah.
So, I know I said a mouthful there, but there is a lot, right? There is a lot. with self-awareness and this question that you have around how can partners help themselves if they don't have a therapist or a counselor or whatever, from turning what is distress or all these other things into self-criticism and self-blame.
Absolutely. Yes, that was just a wealth of information. And you struck a chord with me with something you said because it's a lot to unpack. And some people, they have a hard time with accountability.
Yeah.
And I've met people like that. I've been in relationships with people like that. And
Yeah.
I'm grateful that with my husband and I, we're pretty good at saying, yeah, I messed up. I did this. Take full responsibility for it. This is where I went wrong
Yeah.
and I apologize. And I think being accountable is huge and it's not easy sometimes. But really, the chord that you struck with me was we were probably married 15 years at the time, and my husband was working nights and he was working teleradiology overnight. We never saw him. He wasn't feeling great about himself. He had gained weight. He was grumpy all the time. We were like ships passing in the night and like we hardly ever saw each other. And when we did, it was more a logistical transaction. And I said to him, I love you, but I don't like you right now.
Yeah.
And like I literally said that to him in year 15. It was the worst year of our marriage. And, we talk about it all the time now. And, we reflect on it and go, yeah, like that was a difficult time and we got through it. And
Yeah. Yeah.
it wasn't easy, but, we talked through a lot of things. And I think that that is difficult for people. But when couples are having these difficult conversations,
Yeah.
how can they happen in a way that builds understanding rather than defensiveness, especially in households like medical households that are already stretched really thin?
I think that there are ways of planning for this, but I have to say, I don't think I'm going to say anything that anyone hasn't said before, but I think it's still important to reinforce it here, which is that making intentional space to do this, to have conversations is important. But the way that you start them and
Mm,
planning, I want to be very specific here. I'm not just talking about like, oh, let's have a chat. When I when I'm talking about intentionality, I'm talking about really thinking about you're looking at your calendar, you're looking at your week. What are the days that are coming up where there might be a break? Are there times that your spouse and you, when are you guys both in a better mood or better
mhm,
spirits,
mhm,
right? When is the pressure not as high,
mhm,
right? Is there a time of the week, a day of the week? Really intentional about these things. And then I would say that just like with any conversation that's difficult, I think that you start these conversations with gratitude and finish them with gratitude.
mhm,
And that's a great way to keep the defensive walls down while still having a hard conversation. I'll give you an
mhm,
example. So you begin in gratitude, right, by saying something like, I'm so appreciative of the fact that you got someone to cover for you last month so you can make it to whatever event, right? Whatever it might be. For me, it really shows me that you're making an effort to be present and not to miss the important things. So that's the beginning, gratitude. Here's the harder part, right? Coming in. So I know that that's not something that's possible for you to do all the time, but I would love to see if we can make that happen more often.
mhm,
And now you're entering into the space of talking about possibly negotiating solutions for the future. And that might be like, do you think that maybe we can look at the calendar and plan ahead? Like you can ask for someone to cover you here and then you exchange with them. So, what I'm saying here is that there's a shift from you feeling responsible, the spouse, to make this happen or coordinate, or just expecting that you're just going to have to go at it alone
right.
to this becoming an invitation and you're bringing in your spouse by making them a part of it and helping them, by the way, look at the potential solutions. Because I think there's also sometimes an assumption that, your spouse, they know their schedules, they know better. They know, no, they don't necessarily know. A lot of times they're so overextended with just getting through the day. They're not thinking about next week or tomorrow and forget about 6 months from now.
Right.
So I think that it's important to remember that you may have to bring them into the present day, but I think that if you invite them in a loving way, and by the way, when you start with gratitude, that's a very different invitation than saying, hey, listen, we really need to talk about the upcoming schedules. You made it last month, and my God, yeah, everybody was so happy and it was great, but do you think
Right.
that we could do this more often? It's a very different way of introducing the conversation than really telling them not just how much it meant for you, but noticing the effort that they're putting into it, right?
Kind of like it's not what you're saying, it's how you're saying it.
It's 100% that. And then finishing in gratitude could look like, or sound like rather, I love that we're having these conversations. And the way that you are so open to just discussing the possibilities. Um, is just that's just one of the things that I love about you, and it also makes me feel loved back and so much closer to you.
Mhm.
Now, listen, if it's not your thing to be that sappy, I'm sappy, so that's what I would say. So you don't have to be sappy about it, but you get the idea, right? You begin
Right.
in gratitude and you finish in gratitude. And when you begin in gratitude, the ears perk up. There's an openness versus starting another way, sort of like with a higher intensity.
Mhm.
Oftentimes what that does is put the other person kind of in defense mode, and they're listening so that they can respond,
Right.
not because they're really hearing you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate that you shared that framework of starting with gratitude and ending with gratitude and
Yeah.
kind of putting in the middle the thing that we need to work on because I know for a fact that in medical families, we really hold the time that we have together kind of close to the vest. Like we
Yeah.
really protect that time because it's so limited.
Yeah.
And so when we are kind of looking at the calendar going, when do I want to have this conversation?
Yeah.
You have to be really strategic. And to piggyback on that, whenever we need to share something as a spouse with the physician, many spouses will carefully share that information or kind of censor what they share
Mm,
based on what type of mood the physician comes home in because
yeah.
they feel like I have to walk on eggshells
Yeah.
depending on their mood. And when you're already in a situation like that, it can be really tough. So thank you
Yeah.
for providing that suggestive opportunity for us to plan ahead. And then obviously if you have to pivot because of something that comes up, you pivot, but you've given the framework for approaching a difficult conversation. So that's something that people can take away today and implement right away to kind of improve the situation. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Of course.
As we start to wrap up our time together, is there anything we didn't touch on today that feels especially important for you to share with partners of physicians, particularly those who may be questioning their own emotional responses?
Yeah, I think that a few things actually reiterating that feelings, opposing feelings, can and do coexist. I think that's really important because I think that this is something that is very pervasive
Mm-hmm.
in this particular relationship setup, right? And there's nothing wrong with you wanting more or wanting different, even if the outside world is trying to pressure you into thinking that you have it all. And so I think that's one piece of it. This is about your internal world, and only you have full access to it. So
Mm.
I want to remind people of that. I think the other thing I want to just mention is that if you allow yourself to name the emotions that you're feeling and have these conversations, I think there are some shifts that can happen both internally and externally. I think that it allows for more levity to come into the relationship, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that having needs and expressing them starts to get reframed so that it's less about wanting to not be a burden and more about keeping each other informed about how you're
Mm-hmm.
doing, about how you're growing, and also inviting them to be in it with you. And I think that then the partnership then as a result feels more balanced.
Yes.
And I think the last thing that I would say is to remember that you are a partner in this,
Mhm,
and it is
mhm,
because of your help and your support that the family can be the way it is. So I think that is important to not minimize the impact that your role is having on the
mhm.
family system. And so that those are the things that I think I want to make sure that I reinforce before we go.
Those are beautiful sentiments. Thank you,
Good.
Karen, for that. And I've got two more questions that are signature questions I like to ask every guest. And maybe you hit on them already, but just in case you didn't, here we go. If you could give one piece of advice to help physicians and their families stay connected through the chaos of medlife, what would it be?
So my response here is actually going to be more geared towards those relationships that are in the earlier stages,
Okay.
where there's still more flexibility and
Mm,
energy and openness to talk about how they want to shape their relationship and how they want it to look.
mm-hmm,
There are a lot of missed opportunities, I feel, in early stages of a relationship, specifically um, before they even get married, to
mm-hmm,
discuss things such as values, finances, child rearing, expectations, boundaries, where do we want to live, geography, all these things. We're not saying that that's how it's going to play out, but if you can start these discussions as early as possible and establish a way of checking in with each other, it will be easier to stay connected. I
mm-hmm.
think this is the type of habit that will help you to avoid the chaos rather than just trying to manage through it. And if the chaos can't be avoided, okay, it is what it is, but you at least have a go-to strategy.
Yeah.
So I think that's the advice that I would give is more towards early stage relationships. Not that this can't happen obviously in later stage relationships, but these are habits that we're forming. And if we
Mm-hmm.
can form them earlier and create them and be in sync, it's a contract in a way.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And if you have a contract that you've mutually agreed to, then you have something that you can go back to and say, "Hey, we need to check in with what we agreed on."
Yes, absolutely. And having that open communication is the key to connection for me. I say it all the time that communication is the key to connection. So I love that piece of advice. Thank you.
Yeah.
And now, one of my favorites, since this is the Medlife Support Podcast,
Yeah.
what is your go to life support? That one thing that helps revive you after a tough day or emotionally demanding work?
I mean, for me, and maybe it's no surprise because of the work I do, therapy, coaching, it is having someone to vent to about. That is
Hmm.
incredibly helpful. But I especially love it with my husband. Now, because of privacy and confidentiality laws, right, that govern my profession and,
Hmm.
the physician profession, I can't speak about a
Hmm.
specific client.
Sure.
Sometimes I get creative and I create a
Mhm.
story about a situation, like if it was a character in one of the TV shows that we watched together. So, that in and of itself, just kind of trying to be creative about how to not reveal any identifying information, but also being able to talk about a situation in general. Even the process of doing that already starts to get me out of that feeling
Mm.
because I'm getting creative, right? I'm trying to
Mhm.
figure out, okay, how do I say this without? So just even going through that actually starts getting me out of it. Honestly, if I were a physician who watched medical shows, I would probably be choosing one of the characters from one of my favorite
Sure.
shows, like Grace, The Pit, House,
Yeah.
name it, right? But then I can talk about general situations that I feel frustrated with, or really happy with, really pleased with. And honestly, truly, that has been the most um healing thing for me is just feeling that I don't have to carry it all alone.
Right.
And, sometimes I'll tell them, listen, I'm not looking for a fix. I just want you to
Right.
hear me out. And it's not about something that a client went through or whatever. It's not really about that. I'm mostly talking about my feelings
Mhm.
and expressing, what I was feeling throughout. And it feels very nice to be able to express that to someone who is not going to judge you or say, well, you chose this profession, because that's
Right.
not what I need or what I'm looking for at that time. I just need somebody to lend me their ear, bear witness to what I'm feeling, and then walk beside me. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Yeah.
think we all could benefit from being able to have that sounding board and being
Yeah.
able to be that for someone else too.
Yeah.
So
100%.
before we close today, I want to make sure that our listeners know where they can find you and your works. Can you share where we can connect with you, your practice, your resources, and the Emotionally Wealthy podcast?
Yes, so exciting. People can contact me through my website, which is karenconlon.com. Or, of course, there's all the socials like LinkedIn or Instagram. And then the Emotionally Wealthy podcast on Apple, Spotify, and on YouTube.
Fun.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And is there anything else that you'd like them to explore or take away after listening to our conversation today?
Yes. I think I'm going to answer that with a couple of
Great.
reflection questions. So I think this is what I will leave you with, these two questions. If you could start something small, just one small thing that you've wanted to do, and you can start that tomorrow, what would it be? The second question is, if you could stop one small thing that you've been wanting to stop and you can start tomorrow, what would that be? So I'd invite you to think about those two things. And then after you've thought about those things, I'm going to invite you to take action and start. Start whatever that thing is tomorrow. Stop whatever that thing is tomorrow. Micro steps, baby steps are the way to achieving the bigger milestones. So be kind to yourself and start small.
I love that. I love that. Karen, we will put the link to your website, to your podcast in the show notes so that everyone knows where they can find you. And
Thank you.
I just want to say thank you so much for bringing clarity and compassion to a conversation that many partners didn't even know that they were allowed to have. This
Yeah.
kind of emotional normalization is deeply needed, especially in medical families. So thank you so much for being here with us and sharing your wealth of knowledge. And we look forward to seeing what you do next.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the work that you do. This is incredibly important. You are not just helping individuals, you're helping families. And the better equipped that our physicians and their spouses are, the better the quality of the medical work and treatment and healthcare that we'll have. It does seep into other parts of our lives. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that, Karen. So, my friends at home, remember that when one of you burns out, you both feel the heat. So, take care of yourself and each other. Until next time.
Oh, hey, quick reminder for you that this podcast is for informational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional advice, diagnoses, or treatment. Always consult a qualified professional with any questions you might have.
Thanks to our friends at BuzzSpear for helping with post-production and distribution.